I'm going to try something today that I've never tried before, and that is I'm going to try to make tomato bread. I found this fabulous recipe on the internet, and it requires fresh roasted tomatoes and herbs. So we'll start here. This is my Austin red pear, and all of these tomatoes are super ripe, ready to be picked. So I'm going to pick all of these, and then I'm going to go into the front garden and I'm going to pick some herbs because it said you can use any kind of herbs that you have in your garden. And so after I pick my tomatoes, I'll go into the front garden and get the herbs, and we'll start making bread. So here we are in the front yard. I'm so glad that I picked all of those Austin red pear tomatoes today because they were really ripe and ready to be picked. And if you don't pick them when they're ripe, then they take energy from the plant that should be using the energy for growing new tomatoes. So it was the right time, and I'm going to be using them for a good cause for our tomato bread. So here we have basil in the front yard. Really, I have an embarrassment of riches in terms of basil. I have so much basil. I have 2 transplants here in the front yard as well. So I'm just going to take a clipping of the basil here and put that in my basket. And then I'm going to go over here, and I have some thyme. He's also a transplant from the backyard, and I'm just going to take a clipping here. He was in a pot underneath a little bit of shade, and he didn't like it. So, whoops, I got a pretty big branch there. There he goes. And then I'm going to also take some sage here. This is really great around Thanksgiving, all the sage that you can use for your Thanksgiving meals. I'll take this little piece here. And there we go, there's our herbs. As we head into the kitchen, I have a confession to make. At the beginning of the video, I told you that I had never made tomato bread before. But the fact is, I've never made bread before. I've never used yeast before, so this really was a big adventure for me. But I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I started by roasting the tomatoes, and these were Austin pear tomatoes, a little bit smaller than Roma tomatoes, but I still quartered them and roasted them with a little bit of olive oil. Now, the recipe that I used for this comes from the internet and from a website called The Daring Gourmet. And so at the end of this video, I will link to my blog, and there will be a reference there for you to head over to The Daring Gourmet and find out the exact recipe, because I think you'll really like it. So after I roasted the tomatoes, then I cut up the herbs and cut them up pretty fine. And I didn't have all of the herbs that the recipe recommended. I had whatever was in my garden, and so I used that, and they turned out quite good. And the other thing I did was that the recipe said that if you wanted a little more of a robust taste, you could use some sun-dried tomatoes, and I happen to have a few sun-dried tomatoes in a jar in my fridge, so I threw those in too. I was feeling very adventurous, and those worked as well. So using the yeast and making the dough was really more labor intensive than I expected. So if you're a bread maker, it won't bother you. But if you have never made bread before, just be prepared. It's a little bit of work, but it was worth it in the end. Because I've never baked bread before, I didn't really have a bread baking receptacle. I didn't have a loaf pan for the kind of bread that the recipe called for. So I just used 2 of my glass pans that I had that were smaller, and so I made 2 smaller loaves instead of 1 large loaf. And so, voila, Jill's first loaf of bread straight from the garden. Bread making in quarantine is a worthwhile endeavor, you know? It feeds the soul, it busies the hands, and it makes your house smell fabulous. I recommend it highly.